So welcome everyone. We're having our session on floodplain and watershed higher standards. Welcome everyone. I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the Minnesota State Floodplain Manager, and I'll have my coworkers Gary and Ricky helping me in the background. So today we're talking about higher standards, and I say it's for floodplain and watersheds because so much of what impacts our waters really happens in the full watershed, not just in the official mapped floodplain. So we'll start off with some quick reminders of some of the DNR or the Minnesota higher standards that are already in place. Then talk a little bit, why do we want higher standards? And then we'll be spending the remainder of our time looking at examples of higher standards or other kinds of things that you can do to address doing a better job of protection of our resources. Just a reminder that our laws have been around for over 50 years now here. The Floodplain Management Act, the Shoreline Management Act, and also the same year our SNA Act was enacted in 1969. So we're looking at 55, 56 years now of these rules or the statutes being in place. The rules for floodplain were enacted in 1970, and our shoreland rules got the county version in 1970 and the cities in 1976. So they've been around for quite a while. Some of the standards that we've had from floodplain right from the beginning that are higher than the federal minimums would be that we've got the higher lowest floor requirement at the national level. It has to be at the flood elevation or higher. And we add in freeboard and the stage increase due to establishing floodway. So we've got a higher minimum elevation. The federal regulations allow the squeezing into the floodplain and getting a stage increase of up to a foot. In Minnesota, we've said that's a max of half a foot. And if increasing those flood elevations impacts any buildings, existing buildings, you couldn't do it. We limit uses in the floodway. Most kinds of buildings, our new buildings or additions or expansions, would not be allowed. We've got some nice language about not having pollutants in the floodplain. Then also we've got some regulations that apply to areas going outside of the official FEMA areas. Those of you who have been listening to our other basic trainings, we've talked about this regularly, that in the floodplain, we regulate the area that is the official FEMA floodplain, plus we regulate any adjoining areas that are below the flood elevation, below the base flood elevation. And that's been in our state rules, again, from 1970. We also have our shoreland regulations. So we're regulating within 1,000 feet of lakes that meet minimum sizes and within 300 feet of rivers and watercourses, plus the floodplain area that extends landward. And within those shoreland districts, we've got setbacks, we've got lot size requirements, we look at vegetation management, we look at all kinds of higher standards here. We've got bluff protections and setbacks from the top of the bluff, impervious surface limits. Within the entire shoreland district, we have the minimum elevations that we have in our floodplain regulations. So in much of Minnesota, we've got these higher standards that apply throughout the state. Even if it's not mapped, you can see that going out that 1,000 feet does go beyond the FEMA mapped areas in many of the lake situations. And so sometimes people will forget, the local administrators will forget, they'll be focused on whether it's in a floodplain or not. But remember that entire 1,000 feet from the lake you're regulating. And that has helped reduce the risk in much of the state. We don't have as much flood risk as in many other states because so much of this area that we're regulating with those minimum elevations. And that's especially important in our 8 counties that don't have a FEMA map, where for floodplain perspective, we are requiring those minimum elevations, even though they don't have FEMA mapped areas. And a couple other high level state higher standards, we do have that public water inventory program where we regulate those public waters below the ordinary high, any changes to the course current cross section. And we've had the Wetland Conservation Act since 1991 and have some additional protections. So as there's changes at the federal level and some of those regulations get weakened, luckily we've got some better standards in place at the state level. And some of you may be familiar with the buffer requirements that we've got along water courses and ditches. And we do have this site here where we talk about the buffer requirements, and we link to a map that shows what kind of buffer requirements they have throughout the state. So we've got all kinds of good things that are higher standards that we're doing in the state. That's definitely helped with preserving some of our areas and making things safer, but we've also got a lot of gaps in our regulations. So what are some of the things that are priorities for higher standards? In particular, health and safety. When we're talking floodplain, we're really talking health and safety, looking at both current flooding risk, but then also we're seeing greater magnitude of flooding and different kinds of flooding that we're seeing as we're having the different climate trends that we've been observing over the past decades. One reason might be saving money on the flood insurance premiums. That certainly is a reason for some people, or communities that want to be in FEMA's community rating system, that the more of some of these higher standards they have, the more points they earn and the better rating they get as a community rating system community. That gives you bragging rights and shows that you're doing more to help your community and people to be safer. But it also gives discounts for their flood insurance policies. In general, just trying to prevent those increases in flooding, decrease the runoff so that we can try and reduce at least the increases in flooding that we're seeing with current trends, and preventing degradation of that water quality and the habitat. We've had separate sessions where we've talked about the importance of not losing that natural shoreline area and all the benefits from a water quality habitat standpoint we have in retaining those natural shorelines. And talking about that in general, we really should be talking about the full watershed. So here's some little illustrations that one of our coworkers did quite a few years ago, Walter Watershed, talking about in a natural watershed, you've got those free-flowing streams and rivers, you've got nice diversity in the habitat, you've got cleaner water, your stream bank's stable, you've got good infiltration and storage, but we get a little bit of development, we start having loss of some of that habitat, we start seeing more erosion, less infiltration, and even more development, and it isn't such great water quality. We've lost a lot of the habitat, especially along some of our shorelines, and that does impact water quality in general and the overall health of that watershed. So what can we do to help improve things? But first, let's take a little bit of a look at the climate trends. I've mentioned that we are definitely seeing the patterns of warmer, wetter, more intense storms. We're getting slightly warmer and slightly more annual precipitation, but we're definitely seeing more of that precipitation come in bigger events. So we'll have a flooding period, we'll have a flash drought, and then we'll have more flooding. Much more of those big rains are getting more common. We're also seeing change in the weather through the year. We're seeing rain here in December, January, and February. We just had rain not that long ago. And in the winter of 23-24, we definitely had warmer winter overall, and was referred to as the winter that wasn't in some places. The overall trends for ice cover is that we're seeing shorter periods of time for ice cover. And in 2019, we saw the longest period that the Mississippi was above flood stage in St. Paul. And we're seeing, again, more of these situations where the water levels are staying higher for longer periods of time, and then we'll have more of a drought period. We do have some resources online where you can learn more about some of these trends that we're seeing. On our climate trends page, we do have a link to some nice mapping information and data. This climate trends site, you can look at county or a watershed or even smaller areas, look at the trends for precipitation or for the temperature. Look at it over a longer period of time and see what's going on in your part of the state. We put together this climate trends affecting lakes and rivers page just year and a half ago. It went live. And so we've got this page, the main page, and then we go to what is happening, what does this mean, what can you do? So let's look at the what does this mean. We show some of those overall patterns on that page. And at the bottom, we've got some resources you can look at. And one of those would be the Climate Explorer, which is similar to that other site I was just showing, but we also can look at projected information on that site. Another page here is the what does this mean? And so on that site, I wanted to point out that we've got some more information, especially about animations related to increased temperature and precipitation. And we've got some little animations for both of those showing what's the natural situation, what's the impact of shoreline development having on these things, and what's the impact of shoreline development and the climate trends that we're seeing. So this might be something, if you haven't looked at it or shared it, we were trying to come up with some resources that would be helpful for the general public to understand some of these concepts of why it is that we want some higher standards and some of the trends that we're seeing due to the kinds of development trends that we've had and the climate trends that we're seeing. And some other risks that are related, that we've got issues with groundwater problems and high water tables in some parts of the state during the years where we've got a lot of rain, especially longer rain periods. We see more of the landslides, stream bank erosions, an ongoing concern. We're seeing more impacts of what's sometimes called pluvial, or it's really more the urban flooding, that where the impacts of the intense rains. I mentioned that we're having more of the bigger rains, and there's depressions in the land that the water goes to, and we're seeing way more of the pluvial urban flooding. Some of the other big cities within our FEMA region have really been hit hard, and a lot of the flooding that they're seeing is outside of the FEMA mapped areas because of that urban flooding impact. And recognizing that a lot of areas are not mapped on the FEMA maps. And that's both in those unmapped counties where we chose not to do the maps in the 70s and 80s because we were relying on our shoreland rules for requirements that our buildings meet the minimum elevations. Also, there just are a lot of streams that didn't get mapped for whatever reason. There's still concern and development in those areas, and so we want to be looking at what can we do to recognize those risks. Basically, our state laws are only part of the puzzle. We have some regulations along our streams, and so we're regulating some of those areas. And by our lakes, we've got our shoreland regulations and other related regulations, but we've got an awful lot of our communities that we don't have regulations that would be applicable within our shoreland and floodplain areas. And so a lot of the things that we'll be talking about here are standards or guidance that you can be giving outside of those areas that have state law behind them. What is important for your community? You look at what are the things that are protecting your landowners, your neighbors, and those who are out there, the first responders, the emergency response folks. And do you have updated data that shows higher risk? Should you be applying that? But in general, looking at our priorities for protecting our lakes and rivers and keeping good water quality and keeping good quality of life. We really value across the state, we value our lakes and our rivers and those resources. and want them to be there to be handed on to the next generation. Especially, you might focus on other things if you've got a lot of buildings that are already at risk, and maybe you've got a lot of flood insurance policies. So some of it's going to be specific to your community, what the priorities are. So we've got a lot of things that we'll talk about here. As we're looking at these things, we're trying to balance the benefits of the natural benefits that we've got in these areas with reasonable use of the properties. So we're looking at not increasing the risk for others, having that better water quality, better habitat, retaining that quality of life. But we're also looking at what are the property rights and what are the impacts to those that have development in the areas now. But one thing that does come up is people wonder, is this going to be defendable in court? We can't put these higher standards because people will call it a taking and those kinds of things. But one thing that we've consistently seen in the courts is that as long as we're being consistent in the way we apply our rules, we're not being arbitrary and capricious, we're looking at concerns that are real, and especially those things that we can measure, like the higher standards that impact water quality or impact potential flooding. These things are very defendable, and we've got more data and science to back us up. Those things are upheld in court. And reminder that what doesn't hold up well in court is those situations where communities have rules on the books and they did not follow them, they did not enforce them. And the people who come into court and say, because you didn't enforce your floodplain and shoreland rules, we were impacted. That's when communities are going to lose in court. And there are some great resources in general if you're interested in the legalities. The Association of State Floodplain Managers in particular has got some wonderful resources, and they've had them for many years. Here this document is from '84. They had some great legal stuff in 2016, and most recently they've updated that guidance for communities in 23. And in the slides that we share, we've got the link here to that guide. Where in your regulations are you going to look at putting higher standards? Well, one option would be just to look at adding some sections in your floodplain regulations or in your shoreland regulations, or you might have some special district that you want to look at that you make a separate overlay district. And again, it really depends on what your priorities are for your community and what kinds of things you want to be addressing. We do have more and more areas where we've got some modules, we've got some examples of language that you could be using. Along those lines, in our Minnesota Model Floodplain Ordinance, several years ago, we started calling out some higher standards that we recommend. We make it clear that these are optional or suggested areas, and sometimes it was more clarifications, but a lot of the times it is a higher standard. And we noted in bold blue text. And some of the things that we have in our current model ordinance are things like higher protection for critical facilities, the idea of dryland access, that you don't just put buildings on an island out in the middle of the floodplain, that you've got a safer access to that with the local roads and the driveways to get to those areas, that we say 2 feet below the regulatory flood protection elevation in older ordinances. And in the newer ordinances, we say that you want that access at least at a foot below the BFE to have better access as floodwaters are going up and down and not getting people trapped in areas. We do have language about cumulative substantial improvement, or you could look at some other time period. The minimum requirements, you look at substantial improvement, which is part of the floodplain regulations, over at least a 1-year period. One thing that has been adopted by most communities that updated their ordinance since 2014 was getting the substantial damage based on the increased cost to compliance rep loss language. Basically, if you've got a flood insurance policy, you can get an extra $30,000 to help pay for the cost of bringing your building into compliance if it's substantially damaged. and needs to meet the current floodplain regs. But there's also language that says if you have 2 losses over a 10-year period that add up to more than 50%, that you can get that ICC money only if it's in your ordinance, that local ordinance. So many communities have been adopting these, and we did find that when we put them right into our sample ordinance and just noted they were higher standards, that many communities adopted that. Whereas when we were offering those as separate modules, not so many communities did. So what can communities do? One toolbox would be looking at some of these higher regulations, but there's other things that you've got a bigger toolbox where you're looking at watershed level planning and communication and guidance to people in your community. Maybe you're looking at the policies for what you do at your own community parks and facilities, and using some higher standards at those public facilities. And definitely when we can be educating on some of these higher standards or encouraging or giving cost share, that also can make a big difference in combination with the actual regulations. So here's a cartoon. We've got our itsy ditsy spider going, and reacting to the flash flood warning and thinking that they're nice and safe. They don't even realize that they're at risk. And part of that communication is helping people to realize they're at risk, or that there are issues with not retaining those natural vegetation areas and some of the other things that we want to do a better job of regulating and enforcing. So our shoreland folks have put together their innovative shoreland standards page several years ago. You'll see groups of different ideas for higher standards, and then they've got some examples of the actual ordinance language. This is something that's very helpful if you want to look through there, get some ideas of what other communities are doing and have been successful doing in their communities. From a floodplain perspective, one of the most basic things to be looking at is higher minimum floor elevations. I mentioned in our state model ordinance, we have recommended language for critical facilities, those things that you don't want impacted during a flood. Your main utilities, the emergency response folks, the hospitals, prisons, schools, some of those things that you really don't want to get flooded, and to have extra freeboard, extra elevation above the minimum elevation for them. Again, our state minimum is the base flood elevation plus stage increase that can be up to 1/2 foot plus 1 foot of freeboard. But here's one example in Mower County. They shared what they had to do to calculate this. So we look at a site on the map, we have to go into here, we have to find what that stage increase is, we have to find what the flood elevation is, we have to add all these things together, and that really gets kind of complicated. And they were able to make the argument that let's just use 2 foot of freeboard instead of having to calculate whether it's 1 foot to 1.5 feet. And there's a lot of good reasons for that extra buffer, that extra freeboard there. Another good reason for having a higher minimum elevation is that there were some new HUD rules that went into effect in mid-24 that said new buildings constructed after January 1st, 25, that in order to be eligible for the FHA loans, that they needed to have at least a 2 foot freeboard, that they needed to be at the base flood elevation plus 2 feet. Again, we've been encouraging that at least 2 foot freeboard. Now, I don't know if they're actually enforcing that currently this year with the new administration, but that is a rule that is there in the regulations at the national level. Again, we've had that 2 foot freeboard is what we've been recommending in our model ordinance for the last couple years. Let's looking at some other ways to reduce risk outside of our mapped special flood hazard area. We have a couple different approaches that we show in our model ordinance, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about dam shadows, other local flood-prone areas, and meander belts. So in our model ordinance, we did for a little while emphasize the concept of this regulatory floodplain. So here's our mapped floodplain. It's here at the base flood elevation. That's what's on the FEMA maps. But when we add our 2 foot of freeboard or even our 1 to 1.5 feet of minimum based on the state rules, if you look at that, it should spread that out. Because if you look at the BFE plus 2 feet, the area we're actually saying is possibly at risk is a wider area than what's shown on the FEMA map. Especially if it's a flat area, you'll have a fairly wide expansion of the floodplain when you take that higher flood potential into consideration. On the steeper areas, it might not be as much horizontally. And then a related standard is the federal flood risk management standards, which is something that has been, FEMA updated their rules, their national standards in September of 24, saying that in cases where there's public money going for redevelopment or fixing of things in the floodplain, that there we're going to be looking at the federal flood risk management standard mapped area. So if you're looking at higher risk things, the critical facilities, they take a 3 foot above the BFE or the 500-year, whichever's more. So for those critical facilities, are looking at this bigger area and saying anything that's within this area, if it's damaged and it's going to have federal money to help rebuild it, that they need to be meeting the floodplain regulations. And if it was not a critical action, then it's 2 feet above the BFE or the 500-year, whichever's lower. Again, under this administration, I don't know that this is getting administered, enforced, but it is a requirement that has been in rule since 2024. Another concept is one that I know, for instance, in Wisconsin, that they've had for decades, is looking at below dams, that our FEMA regulated area might be this narrower area, but if you take a dam break into account, we really should be looking at those areas and regulating what's happening within that shadow, that hydraulic shadow, if you have a dam break. And that's something we've considered a couple places in Minnesota, currently haven't enacted that. But we do, again, right next door, they've had this in place for many years. And we're seeing more dams around the country being impacted and failing during floods. We've had the dams in Minnesota that have been impacted and certainly impacted some of the areas downstream. So if you have a high hazard dam, especially, this is something to consider in your community. Some of our communities are doing a great job of looking at local data that they have and having some higher standards locally. Edina's got a nice example of this map that shows the FEMA regulated areas here, in this case in the red, but they show the local areas of concern. So there's all kinds of these, stormwater ponds and lakes that didn't get mapped by FEMA, that the real risk is there. As I mentioned, that urban flooding, the pluvial risk, is very real, and what we're seeing the impacts from more in recent years. So they've got this nice mapper, and it shows those areas very clearly to their citizens, and they regulate in those areas too, so that they're not losing the storage that's needed to avoid increasing the impacts on folks. City of Plymouth, this is an example I continue to show in some of these presentations, and I've used it in national presentations. This is why I'm showing you where Plymouth is here, more for the people that are not in Minnesota. But Plymouth was growing like crazy in the 80s and 90s, and they had a couple developments where they didn't have the regulations they've got now. They had all these buildings that were under construction. They're right next to wetlands. They were not areas where there were lakes over 10 acres and regulated by the shoreland rules. They didn't have any shoreland district requirements. And the only laws in place was that they couldn't do filling below the ordinary high. And so they had all these buildings really close and they weren't meeting any kind of minimum elevations. And this site also is another one of those sites where they had all these wetlands, ponds here. Some of them were public waters and some of them weren't even public waters. So there was very little regulation of what was happening. But as they built, they started having some floods and a lot of wet basements resulted. And they realized that, gee, we need to do more to protect our citizens, and started saying, and this is where those developments are in the city, but started realizing that we need some higher standards than the state requirements. And they had a citywide stormwater management plan. They'd calculated what their 1% annual chance flood elevation would be in all these sub-water basins. So they said, we're going to, within all of these sub-watershed where we've got these calculated flood elevations, any of the buildings in those sub-watersheds, we're going to require that their lowest floor is 2 feet above that. Citywide, they started having these. They also went through a very nice inventory of their wetlands and established some riparian buffer requirements and setbacks on all of the wetlands. And this is going on in the early 1990s. So in this example here of a higher quality wetland, they had a little bit more of a setback and buffer requirement. And they also required monuments of where the edge of that buffer is. So some very nice protections for the future building that was still going on in the city. A little too late for those earlier developments, unfortunately. Shifting gears, talking about rivers. And rivers are very dynamic. You can see here that the river is trying to re-meander within this area that had been ditched in the past. Here's part of the old oxbow there. So another example of just how dynamic they are. You can see all these different areas where the meanders have gone in the past. And in a lot of the aerial photos, you can actually see the past meanders, or even in the USGS quads, you can see how rivers have moved a lot, and that's their natural system, is moving a lot over time. Here's an example. This is Minnesota City. This is where the river was historically, but then we had the big flood in 2007 and the river came way over here. The next aerial photo I was able to catch, they'd already done some of the repairs of that area, but this is what it looked like. The river was not right next to these buildings before the big flood, but that big flood did make the riverbank come and expand quite a bit and really impacted a lot of buildings. So encouraging communities that have a lot of river areas to be looking at some kind of a meander belt requirement, recognizing that they're going to move around and we want to acknowledge that. And that's something that's going on constantly. Every big flood we have, the river meanders are moving around. We have some great examples of regulations and the way that they map things in Vermont and the state of Washington. But the concepts will get at what is the meander belt for that type of river. And that's something in DNR, some of our folks in other units have been doing a lot of great research on what do we consider to be that meander bank area that we would need to have a more stable environment for where the river's going. And that river ecology unit has some nice resources. Here's a resource sheet with all kinds of links to information. Then just want to shout out for what they're doing in state of Washington. Pierce County in particular has had some requirements for many years where they leave these areas for protection and have some bigger setback areas. And they've got a site called Floodplains by Design that's got some nice background information, some videos, certainly some things to think about if you've got more riverine areas. Another great resource is the Vermont River Corridors. resources. So they've got a whole page about their river corridors, and they've got this citizen handbook, which I think there's a lot of good things in there that we could be using in communities where we're trying to encourage better management and understanding of our citizens that are in stream areas, riverbank areas. So, what are some other things that we can be doing? It's regulating outside of, again, those unmapped areas. So, for instance, cities that don't currently have shoreline management regulations, they can adopt them. In the 90s, when we were really ramping up getting official notice out to cities, but the counties all were required to adopt their shoreline regulations. But many of the cities got divided into tier 1, 2, 3, and 4 in terms of priority, and we only officially notified priorities 1 and 2 communities to adopt shoreline regs. But there's a lot of communities that have shoreland areas that haven't adopted. We would encourage those communities to reach out, and you can get help from DNR staff on putting those regulations together. Or another thing that we're looking at and working on now is a shoreland light option for communities that maybe you weren't notified that you had to adopt some shoreland regs, but trying to get some of the key things into your local regulations to protect people for the future and preserve as much as of that natural area and the habitat and the benefits of those with what you do have in your community. The other thing here is minimum elevations and setbacks in the whole community, like that Plymouth example. And I mentioned restricting critical facilities. Here's just a couple examples of why you would want that. Cedar Rapids in 2008. I think many of us heard about the big impacts they had to these public facilities that were on an island in the middle of the river that really got impacted. Owatonna here, an example of the water facilities there. The hospitals being impacted, and Methodist Hospital in St. Louis Park having to deal with this. Well House here in Owatonna, just lots of places where they've had to deal with these things, and in many cases they've then afterwards come back and put in some higher standards or been able to get some greater protection for those critical facilities. At the national training that FEMA does, City of Rochester made it into their manual. They talked about the big flood in 78, where they've got this pictures of the first responders being helpless at this nursing home and not able to get in and help them, and that this notes that 4 people died there. And overall in Rochester, they had a good third of the city that was impacted by the 78 flood. But luckily since then, they've put in a nice flood control project that greatly has reduced the impacts. But you still want to be looking at higher elevations for those critical facilities, but also doing some of those flood control projects to reduce the risk where it makes sense. Another support for having the higher minimum elevations is ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers, I think that stands for. But they've got their Bulletin 2414, and they've got standards in there that class 3 buildings, that's schools, prisons, large group facilities, that their minimum elevation be at least the flood elevation plus a foot, and that essential facilities are class 4. And these end up in building code, and we're in the process of getting that into the Minnesota rules 1335, which is the floodproofing rules statewide. And that the current rules refer to the old 1972 Corps of Engineer floodproofing regulations. So working on getting these criteria into our state rules for floodproofing, that they would have these higher standards in the future. And I have to note that a new version of ASCE did come out at the end of 24. It's the 24-24 update. They've got some even higher standards. They would regulate for regular buildings most regular buildings, they're class 2 homes, main businesses that aren't a class 3 or class 4, that they have to be at least above the 500 year. They upped the class 3 requirement from BFE plus 1 foot to being above the 750 year flood. And they upped the class 4 for essential facilities from BFE plus 2 or the 500 year to 1,000 year. And of course, we don't have the 750 or 1,000 year calculated anywhere in our official floodplain mapping, but the Louisiana state, I think it is, has the tool to try and calculate that. And there was a nice presentation done on this. It's about half an hour. If you want to go look at that, that's in this link to that recording about ASCE's 2424. And our presenter, Manny, gets into a lot more detail about that. And this just shows what's considered class 4. So hospitals, emergency response type situations, emergency shelters, those utilities you really need going during a flood, communication kinds of things. So we do mention these again in our model ordinance. Some of our cities and more rural counties have adopted the standards of saying, we're not going to allow any new buildings in the 100-year floodplain. That we've got plenty of development area outside the 100-year floodplain. Let's not deal with this. Let's just have everybody build in those safer areas that are outside the mapped 1% or 100-year floodplain. Here, we're showing that Nicollet County for many years has said no new buildings, even in the 500-year floodplain, that much higher level of protection. Now, admittedly, they originally started doing that because they were misinterpreting the old gray shaded areas on the old paper map. But once they realized that they were regulating the 500-year, they made it the actual ordinance consistent with what they had been doing there. But many of our small cities, if they don't have development in or near their current mapped areas, we've encouraged them to do what we call a simplified ordinance, which basically says no new buildings in the floodplain. And then if they did in the future have development pressure in their floodplain, we could always look at the full ordinance and allowing development in those areas where it's allowed in the floodplain. But in the meantime, they're having that extra level of protection with a simpler ordinance. I mentioned the dry land access requirements. We have that in our sample ordinance. We do have some language regarding that in state rule, but it's not consistent in all the zones. But in our ordinance, we recommend that they have that access, or they have an evacuation plan, or they verify that the depth times velocity is no more than a factor of 4. So 2 foot deep flooding with 2 feet per second, or 1 foot deep with 4 feet per second, that you don't want it to be too deep and too high velocity for someone to be able to walk through. So the higher velocity, higher depth is definitely a higher risk. And that makes sense. Mention that in Minnesota, we've got the good fortune of having watershed districts. They were authorized back in 1955. I think the first watershed was really established a couple years later. But we now have many watersheds in the state, and they've got rule authority, and they can assess properties to do projects. And many of them get grants and can acquire property to do projects and do a lot of different kinds of flood reduction projects and have some higher rules to reduce that potential future damage. And this shows in the metro area, we've got a lot of our watersheds, and especially in the Red River Valley along those rivers where we've had flooding issues for many, many years. Some of the common things you'll see at a community level or watershed level is they've done some updated modeling. They've updated their modeling using Atlas 14. I'll just show a quick example of what that is in a slide here. Or looking at other kinds of future conditions modeling and taking into account the trends and the weather patterns we're seeing, that we are seeing those bigger floods over time. And then a lot of the other rules that they have to do with maybe more stringent impervious surface requirements, that you have to infiltrate a portion of that runoff. A typical requirement might be that an inch of the runoff, that increased runoff, either in all the increased runoff that you measure with the current situation versus what you would see with the new development, gets retained and either infiltrated or released over time, or a portion of it, that the first inch of precip gets infiltrated and detained in some way. When I talk about the Atlas 14, that's recognizing that with more years of data, we're seeing higher trends in the amount of precipitation. The old technical paper 40 came out in 1960, had data up through 1960. And then in 2013, they came out with Atlas 14, which took another 50 years of data and more stations into account. And in many places, it really increased what we were seeing there. Oh, and I need to mention that they've been working on Atlas 15, both updating those historical trends with that, another decade of data, and starting to include some future projections. And we did have someone with NOAA talk about that effort in LGU forum that we had back in October, and we've got a link to that presentation if you'd like to know more about that. Highest low floor requirements, sometimes basing it on that 500 year. So like here, we're showing where we've got data. That's very helpful. And in places where we had detailed studies, we have the data for the 10-year, 50-year, 100-year, and the 500-year. Some other things that watersheds and communities are doing is having requirements that there's no new impervious surface, maybe in the 10-year floodplain or within 25 feet of a watercourse. There's some really creative things going on there. And like I mentioned earlier, not allowing an increase in the peak runoff, combining it with some water quality improvements. So you're seeing more requirements for these retention areas if there's new development or expansions of the hard surface, or looking at the regional facilities where you've got a big area that when you've got a bigger rain, I think this picture I took after like a 2 or 3 inch rain, but then a lot of the year it can be used for other activities. So in this example, some elementary kids out there playing soccer. Here's a couple examples in Bassett Creek where they've got some nice retention areas and they've left it more natural, getting those natural beneficial functions there in their retention areas. And in this area, they've got, you can't see them, but they've got some underground storage also. Many of the watersheds will have a no net loss of compensatory storage, no net loss of storage. Dakota County actually says they have to have a 2-to-1 replacement of storage, and it's got to be on the same parcel. So that's really limited a lot of the fill in the floodplain in that area. More of the commercial areas getting these rain gardens or retention areas and getting a little bit of educational signage up there. And although they also have to think about making sure that snow doesn't go in there and take away from that storage area. And even small communities. This is a sign I saw as I was driving by. I went and looked, and a very nice sign showing a rain garden in the city of Madison Lake, which is not a very big city. And using some of the data that we've got, one of the things that we've been getting in more recent years is this concept of the 100-year plus. We regulate to the 100-year at a minimum, but when you're calculating that 1%, they have a range of data, and they take the median in there is what we actually regulate usually. But this 1% plus is the concept of, I think it's the 90th percentile there, but it's within that standard deviation of the median there. And take a look at what that 1% plus is, maybe compared to your 500-year or your BFE plus 2 or whatever you're using for your minimum elevations. And we're getting that 100-year plus and these other frequencies in more of our recently mapped areas where we've got more recent data. And I should add Murray and Aiken, we've also got the preliminary data for all those other frequencies. Some other non-regulatory options, better communication on, what are the real depths of the flooding? What's the percentage of possibility of flooding over a 30-year period? Because being in the 500-year floodplain doesn't sound like a big deal, but that's 11% when you're just outside of the floodplain and you're in the 500-year, or that you got basically a quarter chance of being flooded if you're on the very edge of the 100-year floodplain. A lot of good information that's come out, some documents we put together in 2019 when we had been having a lot of really high water periods. That was over a 7-year running period. That was the highest water levels we've been seeing in the state. Just a reminder to enforce regulations and not allow people to be putting in these sterile riprap hardscapes when there's not actually an erosion problem. Not having all that native vegetation removed ends up in more erosion. And even if it's on public property, this is an example in parkland. There's a pond here and this area around the pond where you've got some vegetation growing, but the city would go and chop it all down, and including in that same spot, the milkweed I'd happened to take a picture of, and then what it looked like a little bit later when they had chopped it down. Well, I can say that this same area, they are now doing a prairie restoration, working with Friends of the Mississippi River. So we're seeing a nicer mix of vegetation now on that area, which is a good story and things that we want to encourage at the local level. So we do have a link to this how-to guide. I should say that's something that the ASFPM, the Association of State Floodplain Managers, put together for development in general in subdivision development here. And ending with our spider being better protected in the end if they do some of these things we've been talking about. I want to say thanks to everyone for attending today. I hope that it was helpful information. We appreciate folks coming